in pursuit of health and wisdom. Sapio with Buck Joffrey.
Hey, it's Buck Joffrey. I want to tell you about an interesting study that just came out. But before I do that, let me set the stage. The difference between Alzheimer's disease and dementia. So they're kind of interchangeable. Dementia actually describes sort of the type of clinical manifestation of a disease, which involves things that you think of when you think about Alzheimer's disease. You think about having trouble remembering things, forgetting people in your own family. There's general cognitive decline and an inability to basically function in the real world. So that's basically what we think of when we think of dementia. The other key part of it is that it doesn't wax and wane. In other words, it's not like someone has a bad night and they have these symptoms, but in the morning they're all better. In dementia, they're sort of chronic and they're progressive. They get worse over time. Now, Alzheimer's disease is actually just one kind of dementia. And Alzheimer's disease specifically involves something called the formation of beta amyloid plaques in the brain. That's how you diagnose it. You have all these symptoms and then you do an MRI and it shows beta amyloid plaques in the brain. But as it turns out, there's actually a lot of other causes of dementia as well. You could have small vessel disease. So people who've got various types of disease in their blood vessels, cardiovascular disease. Sometimes they can have these little micro strokes throughout, and that can cause that kind of dementia symptoms. There's also something called diffuse Lewy body dementia. I don't want to confuse you. The bottom line is all of these are types of dementia. And so the question is, what kind of risk are you at for dementia? And is there anything you can do to avoid it? Researchers at the University of Oxford studied over 22,000 patients to create a dementia disease risk tool called the UK Biobank Dementia Risk Score tool. That's a long name, I know, but this basically helps predict the likelihood of developing dementia over the next 14 years if you're between the ages of 50 and 73. Now, we'll put a link at the bottom of this clip so that you can get the tool. But what I'd like to do is kind of just tell you about the risk factors involved. And the reason why this is so important is that previous research has suggested that 40% of dementia cases can potentially be averted by lifestyle changes. So what I'm going to do is to break these down into a few different categories. First, there's just stuff that you can't really do anything about because, well, that was the way you were born. For example, age. The older you are, the more likely you are to develop dementia. The next factor, being male. Okay, some might argue that you can do something about that, but even if you did, I'm not sure that's going to change the risk profile, so I'm going to leave it in this category of not being able to do anything about it. The next one is parental dementia. One of your parents had dementia. Now, there is a genetic component to dementia, and that doesn't mean you're going to get it for sure, but if your parents have it, it makes it more likely that you're going to get it. In particular, there's a gene variant called ApoE4, and that is actually the strongest genetic risk factor for Alzheimer's disease that there is. Having a single copy of the gene actually increases your risk of Alzheimer's by 2 to 3 times. 2 copies of the gene, which means that you got one from each parent of yours, gives you up to 12 times the risk of developing Alzheimer's disease. Now, the next category that I'm going to give you is the category of bad luck, right? Bad luck. You just got kind of screwed on the luck of the draw. Whether you have these risks is largely based on the demographic you were born into. So here I put one, education. The more education that you have, the less likely you are to develop dementia. Maybe that's because you might be, I don't know, exercising your brain more, but who knows? More likely it has to do with the higher levels of poverty associated with less education. Having less education also leads into the next risk factor, which is levels of deprivation. If you're poor, you are more likely to develop dementia. Why? Well, I think it's because of the next several risk factors that may really be controllable to a certain extent, and this is where we want to focus. Now, what about the stuff you have more control of? Again, research suggests that 40% of dementia cases could be avoided by lifestyle intervention. So this could be the difference between you getting dementia and not. So the first one that you can absolutely control is high cholesterol. This one, well, it's frankly, it's kind of easy at this point. Obviously, we've got exercise, we've got diet, and we got drugs. We have all the drugs we need, in fact, to destroy this risk factor. The drugs that we talk about on this show, like statins and Repatha. I mean, it essentially makes high cholesterol something that you can easily change, and this should not be a risk factor that you have to be worried about at all. The next risk factor that you can potentially change, high blood pressure. Again, for the most part, you can do something about this. Lose weight, exercise, diet, and again, medications. The vast majority of high blood pressure can be controlled with or without medications. History of stroke. Well, I know you can't really control a history of stroke because it's already happened, but you can control your risk of having a stroke. Now, if you control your blood pressure, like we talked about before, you keep your cholesterol controlled, you can make the risk of stroke for you extremely unlikely. My friend and colleague Alan Viglione and I have talked about this several times, where literally with all of the medications and interventions that we have today, having a heart attack or a stroke, I mean, it should be it shouldn't be the leading cause of death in the United States. It shouldn't even be in the top 5. So that's something you can easily control if you take control yourself. The next one is the history of diabetes. Now, if you've listened to just some of the past shows we've done, we keep hitting this idea that high blood sugar is a killer, and diabetes is a defect in sugar metabolism. But here's the thing, between exercise, diet, and medications, again, you should be able to reverse or at least minimize high blood sugar and diabetes. Okay, now there's some other factors here as well, which again, they're kind of controllable, I think. And one of them, oddly enough, is living alone. Now, this one goes back to what we know about human needs for social support. People need to be around other people and to have a purpose. They need to actively engage with the world. And if they don't, they aren't as healthy and they don't live as long. We have data, we have scientific data that suggests this. And as far as your brain goes, there is a use it or lose it component for sure. Living alone in older people correlates with less social interaction. It also correlates with the next risk factor, which is depression. Now, to be fair, depression is a disease, and to some extent, you can't really control being depressed, right? Some people just, they have it, like some others have asthma or something like that. However, there are things you can do, again, to decrease the risk of depression or to do something about it if you get depressed, being active and exercising and again, eating well. And of course, going back to the same thing again, there are medications that can help with depression. So bottom line is, you have control of over half of the major risk factors associated with dementia, and that's why 40% of dementia cases are thought to be avoidable. A lot of this is really up to you. Now, that's it for this brief medical update from Sapio with Buck Joffrey. I'm Buck Joffrey. If you like what I'm doing, make sure to like, share, and subscribe.